Hello there ladies and gentlemen, Paul TX141 Walsh here, welcoming you to an all new pair of Ace in a Day gameplays for the arcade mode of War Thunder. In today's episode we're reviewing the plane that you've all requested for a very long time and one of my personal favourites. That is the TA-152 C-3, a German fighter aircraft coming into tier 4 and a battle rating of 6.3. For our historical overview today, we're going to be focusing in particular on the C variant of the TA-152 and eventually onto the C-3 subvariant. Let's begin. The C variant of the TA-152 can trace its origins back to Kurt Tank's Focke-Wulf 190 RA4D proposal in 1942. The original concept was for a plane designed much like the Focke-Wulf 190D, but powered by the Daimler-Benz DB603 engine. Work on the TA-152 design in general only began in earnest in the spring of 1944, due to Luftwaffe's focus on improving fighters currently in production rather than producing new designs altogether. However, it was the Luftwaffe's Technischer-Amt or technical department that insisted that the TA-152 was to field the Junker-Jumo 213E engine, and so the Focke-Wulf 190 RA4D proposal was to be redesignated as the TA-153 project. It was only through Kurt Tank's persistence in wanting to install the Daimler-Benz DB603 engine in a TA-152 airframe, aware of the fact that the engine outperformed the Junker-Jumo 213E engine at higher altitudes, that the TA-152C design continued to be developed at all. As a result, there were now two short wingspan TA-152 variants in development, the B as powered by the Junker-Jumo 213E engine and the C as powered by the DB603. With the Luftwaffe aware of the potential performance of the DB603, the C variant was prioritised as of November 1944, despite the fact significant ground had already been made in the development and the potential production of the B variant. This decision was reinforced by the initial test flight of the first TA-152C prototype, designated Focke-Wulf 190 V21U1 in October of 1944. By January of 1945, the first TA-152 C0 prototypes entered the test program, and by April of the same year, prototypes had been produced and tested for the C1 through to the C3 subvariant. Test evaluations marked the C variant out as a Storer or a destroyer due to its Daimler-Benz DB603 power plant, which came with methanol water 50 or MW50 injection as standard, and its ability to mount for armament one 30mm cannon in the engine, either the Mk108 with 90 rounds per gun for the C1 and C2 subvariants, or the Mk103 with 80 rounds per gun for the C3, two 20mm MG151 cannon with 150 rounds per gun in the engine cowling, and two 20mm MG151 with 175 rounds per cannon in the inboard of the wings. Hence this was an ideal aircraft for the Interceptor role. All three subvariants were to be powered by the Daimler-Benz 603LA liquid-cooled 2100 horsepower engine. The C-3 was the heaviest of the subvariants, with a normal mass of 9,059 pounds or 4,109 kilograms and a fully loaded mass of 11,997 pounds or 5,442 kilograms. However, in the end, the TA-152C never saw service, as the factories at which the planes were being assembled were overrun just as the planes had entered their initial component assembly stage. And with our historical overview concluded, let us take a look at how the TA-152C3 handles in War Thunder's arcade mode. Our first game of today takes place on the frontline map Gorge. For this we'll be using the following setup. Stealth belts are a 20mm cannon, reasoning being these belts are quite potent, with 60% of their composition being high explosive incendiary Minengeschoss rounds, and more importantly, they lack tracers, which means that when we open fire, we're only going to see the tracer of our 30mm cannon belt, and we can direct our 30mm cannon more accurately onto the foe. For our 30mm cannon, which packs the greater punch, we're using the air target belts, which consist 75% of high explosive incendiary Minengeschoss rounds of some description. These are lethal against enemy fighters and do a good amount of damage in the long haul against enemy bombers. For our gun convergence, we're using a 700m gun convergence. Logic being, we prefer to keep our foes at longer distances, and we need a gun convergence setting that's ideal for this because of the inboard mounted 20mm cannon, i.e. in the wings. This gun convergence is good for head-on passes, and the reason I'm not using 800 metres is because I've personally found it not to be as effective in this aircraft, but it does come down to personal preference. For our fuel load, we're taking the typical 30-minute fuel load to ensure we can make it to the end of the game unscathed on fuel capacity. With that, we begin our analysis of the C-3 as per the norm by talking about climb rate. And what we can see here is that one of the redeeming features of the C-3's otherwise just standard climb rate is that it's consistent and enduring, whereby we're able to go from as low as 1,000 meters altitude at a climb angle of approximately 25 degrees, managing our war emergency power accordingly, all the way up to 6,000 meters plus in a single climb. And even at our battle rating tier, there are a few aircraft that can say they can do that as well. There will be a number of planes that will outclimb you in shorter durations, such as the Spitfire F Mark 24, the Tempest 2, the Messerschmitt 19K4, the M1K2J8, etc. In fact, it's quite a large roster. But in terms of long-term climb rate, the only planes that are going to be matching that in essence will be the likes of the TA-152H, and even that struggles by comparison. Therefore, if you're not intercepted early on, this enables you to get a lot of altitude and therefore build up a huge amount of energy, in terms of your potential energy and that which you can convert into speed, i.e. kinetic energy. As we can see here, when we're up against enemy jets, having the energy advantage provides us with a huge advantage straight away against the foes that will be very difficult to catch if they're allowed to build up their speed and altitude. Which is why we're now proceeding to intercept an enemy Yak-15 off in the distance. What this also means is that if there are enemy bombers, and there's a large number of them on the enemy team, you can very quickly get to the altitude to intercept them, especially if you start seeing B-29s assaulting your airfield at an altitude of 7,000 meters plus. You'll be able to get up there, no issue. As we now start diving down towards this Yak-15, we'll try to force them into a head-on and take them out accordingly. We're building up our speed gradually in the dive. We don't have the best dive speed acceleration, but it's decent, with the heaviness of this plane helping us out somewhat. And having opened fire, we miss, they miss their 23mm cannon shells on us, and we loop over the top. But because of the amount of speed we built up from gaining initial altitude advantage, the fact the Yak-15 had to put their nose up for that encounter, as they dive away now, we can begin to catch up, using the heaviness of our plane once again in order to improve our diving characteristics somewhat. We track out their path, open fire at distance, and score a good number of hits at roughly 900 meters distance, setting the Yak-15 on fire and causing them to burn to death. In the meantime, as we level out then, we talked about nose heaviness and heaviness of the plane. Well, what do we mean? Well, in general, folks, this is a very heavy fighter aircraft, and it's something you have to get used to. What you're going to see in this gameplay and the next one is the fact that we're very adverse to dogfighting in general. We will if needs be if we're pressed, dogfight, but that's a discussion for the second gameplay. If anything, we're focusing on very linear gameplay, boom and zoom elements, and interception, especially against enemy bombers or aircraft that are rising to intercept our own team's bombers. And talking about attacking bombers, as we pick up the Yak-15 kill, we're now going to strike this PV-4Y. It's quite a distance away, but as we build up our speed once again, we come swinging down them, scoring some opening hits, and then finishing them off for our second kill. Before building up the nose once again, and we can see we took some hits to our left wing, nothing major. And the durability of the airframe of the C-3 is rather good and is something to be respected, and it will get you out of some rather difficult situations as we're going to see later on. The weakest part of this plane in terms of durability is the engine. If it does take some hits, it will get knocked out quite easily. But that's quite typical at this battle rating tier, what are the burst masses, or burst mass ratings we should say, that everybody's got available to them. The difference is the engine seems to be very well protected in this aircraft, and therefore you can afford to take those risks exposing the engine. As we take out this Focke-Wulf 190A8 using our 20mm cannon alone, as they try to cut over the top of us, and we finish off reloading our 30mm cannon. Time to pursue the other Focke-Wulf 190. A note here as we open fire at long distance, how the similar muzzle velocity of both the 30mm cannon and the 20mm cannon means we don't have to worry as much about providing additional lead for one weapon over the other. And this is a pleasure in this aircraft compared to our experience in the TA-152H, whereby you had the very low muzzle velocity but high fire rate 30mm Mk108 compared to the high muzzle velocity, high fire rate 20mm MG151s. And this contrast meant that in order to hit a target with one weapon, you had to forego the usage of the other weapon, unless you got your foe into a situation where they were stalled out underneath you and you could strike them in a pretty much stationary position or them dead above. Therefore, having everything working together here means that you can use that 8.19 kg per second burst mass rating to its full potential, and hopefully you've seen that so far. when this plane hits, it shreds things to pieces, no matter how durable they are. But now we have an issue, and this is where we go on to one of the weaker aspects of the C-3. We have an enemy F8f Bearcat that really wants to get rid of us. Now the problem is we can manage this engagement and make sure the fight never happens, because the Bearcat has got a number of advantages over us. It's got roughly the same top speed for all intents and purposes, unless we go to the most extreme speeds, whereby we should have a rough advantage but not by a huge margin from what I recall. It's got the superior climb rate, whether it's in short bursts or longer bursts. It's got the superior turn circle and overall manoeuvrability, excluding roll rate, which this plane has in droves, but more on that later. And in general, the Bearcat can pick the engagement much more easily than we can, because of all the deficits we have. But here, as we just try to pull some distance on the Bearcat, who seems to be adverse to engaging so early on, perhaps they're getting a bit frustrated that we're actually trying to lead them towards our teammates, i.e. over our airfield. What we have to note here is that if we do get one foe with similar or superior performance to us, and that's going to happen on a regular basis as discussed previously, we have to try and make them pick the engagement at a bad time for the opponent. Because really we're at our opponent's mercy as to whether they leave us alone and go to a different target, which is what we're hoping here with this Bearcat, or whether they're going to be insistent and follow us around the map. Now as we gain some altitude, we can see that the Bearcat is just matching us altitude gain for altitude gain, and it's a very frustrating experience to have. And as we can see as we turn about here 180 degrees, how wide our turn circle is. In fact, in my experience, this is the widest turn circle of any dedicated fighter or interceptor at the battle rating and tier. A single engined one at that, so we're not talking about the likes of the F8f Bearcat. Although planes such as the Bearcat will give the C-3 a run for their money in terms of the overall dogfight capability. So now, what we're hoping is that if the Bearcat is going to insist on fighting us, they're going to come in a situation whereby they're going to have to come from above and give us ample room for us to initiate a head-on pass. Now the reason we say about come from above is because we want to slingshot, i.e. we want to dive down, split test and then come back up at them with a lot of energy and force a head-to-head pass. Or alternatively, if they decide to try and climb away from us, we'll have the last ditch attempt at trying to shoot them down before they perform a hammerhead and before we stall out. And that's a worry. Our stall characteristics are actually quite poor, whereby our stall speed is 180 km an hour. You may be thinking at this point, well, that's not too bad, we're heading into the region of the TA-152H1 and the likes of the Yakovlev Yak-3P. Well, the issue on top of that is that you start to feel your stall characteristics as early as 275 km an hour, whereby in particular the elevator becomes very heavy at this speed and descending. And that means you're really exposed if you're trying to perform any manoeuvres where you need to lift the nose even more. So you need to be very careful about this and make sure your speed does not drop below 300 km an hour at any point in time where possible. But as the Bearcat continues to follow us at this point, we're getting ready to set up the engagement. We want them at this rough distance. We're going to start initiating our split air shortly, and we're hoping they're going to go for it. And keep in mind that all of our guns are concentrated towards the nose. In an F8f-1B, the 20mm cannon are mounted in the wings. And think why this may be a bit of an issue for the Bearcat as we initiate the dogfight. We'll talk about it afterwards. As we're getting ready, we're teeing up, and here we go. So going into the split S at this point, we're now starting to bring the nose up. We're going to initiate our combat flaps as well to provide a little bit more lift come about earlier on. Going head to head here, we cut them apart accordingly and only take some scathing fire to our tail section, picking up our race. Now the reason the Bearcat didn't do as much damage to us, although they almost knocked out our tail control, is because in short, they had a wing-mounted cannon, which means they're convergence reliant. Now typically, at high battle ratings, foes prefer long-distance convergences, or at least from my experience, i.e. 600 meters plus. As the majority of our firepower is concentrated in the nose, so two 20mm cannon and one 30mm cannon, we do not have to worry about this, we just need to provide the right vertical lead. And there in that head-to-head, we managed to get in close enough to make sure the convergence of the Bearcat was too distant from the distance of our plane, and it meant it wasn't a problem. And our durability, i.e. our airframe's durability, meant that we didn't lose our tail control, meanwhile they lost their life. So it worked out for us, and that's the last ditch resort we can use. If our fire is insistent, we'll force a head on, and in the majority of cases, get away with it. Because the majority of our foes will have wing-mounted weaponry compared to our nose-mounted weaponry. But here, as we dive down the Focke-Wulf 190, the game comes to its end, and it's time for us to take a look at the post-game stats. With our 5 kills, we're able to pick up 29,765 silver lions and 3,575 research points. Also pointing out that we are using a 10% research point booster in this match. So far then, hopefully we've demonstrated the 3 core strengths of the C-3. The first one being its enduring climb rate, whereby this is one of the few aircraft at its battle rating tier that can go from pretty much ground level, so long as you start off your climb at a speed of 400 km an hour and a climb angle of 25 degrees and manage your WEP accordingly, all the way up to altitudes in excess of 6,000 metres, and then be in a position where it can be competitive still. On top of that, what we've also got to consider is the fact that the concentration of firepower in or around the nose on this plane and its very high burst mass rating means that this plane can shred any foe that crosses its path, so long as the pilot is accurate with the firepower. And the third item is the durable airframe, whereby the only weak spot of this plane really is the engine, but it's going to take an accurate shot on the engine in order to damage it, or with a good amount of protection surrounding the engine. On the other side of the coin, however, what we've also seen is one of the core weaknesses of the C-3, and that is its lack of overall manoeuvrability, or lack of really any means to get out of a dogfight against a given foe, if the foe is able to get into a position where they can confront the C-3 accordingly. Whereby you don't have the manoeuvrability, nor do you have the outright climb rate or the outright pace to get away from the vast majority of your competition if they're able to close the distance. Therefore, when it comes down to confrontation, you may be forced to either dive away to very low altitudes, or if that's not possible, try to force a head-on and use your firepower advantage accordingly. What with the majority of your opposition having armament in the wings rather than the nose, and therefore you've got to prey on your accuracy and at the same time the convergence setting of your opponent's armament being incorrect for the given head-on situation. But now let us move on to our second game of today. We begin to look a little bit more at the weaknesses of the C-3, but we can also see it in its element, not just interception, but also escorting. Our second game of today takes place on the frontline map Fiery Arc. Using the same setup as before, this time we're not going to be given the freedom at the start of the match to use our climb rate to ascend to a high altitude position. Instead, we're going to be confronted thanks to a member of the enemy team using a blind hunt order which decides to pick us of all the targets. As a result, we're going to have to cut our climb short and make the most of the situation, whereby to avoid being confronted early on, we're just going to have to keep our eyes open and measure the distances between us and our foes a little bit larger than in other aircraft that we may fly. And if anything, this will be a recollection of our experience in the F8f Bearcat, which we reviewed previously, link available in the top right corner of your screen as displayed now. As long as we can see our foes coming in at a good distance, we'll be able to set the situation up such that we will have an equal energy position, or the best energy position we can provide, and perhaps we can make them turn away because we'll prove too much of a time waster for them. Continue our climb for now then. As we look towards the distance, we'll see the enemy fighters starting to come up, and there'll be one Messerschmitt 19 in particular who really wants a piece of our plane. But as we do climb, one thing we should note is that the altitude limitations of the C-3 are rather interesting, whereby there's no low level threshold as such. Your performance will stay consistent from ground level all the way up to 6,000 metres altitude, at which point you'll experience a change in the controllability of this aircraft, whereby its control surfaces will begin to become heavier, especially the elevator. And this only gets worse as you go to higher and higher altitude. Meanwhile, engine performance wise, the engine performance of this plane only begins to decay at 10,000 metres altitude, at which point your acceleration will drop off quite sharply. But this means that you can give your longer winged brother, the H variant, a run for its money, whereby that plane made for higher altitudes is going to experience only the better turn circle compared to you, and less of a drop off in controllability above 6,000 metres altitude. But as we bring down this B-29A for our first kill, we'll note the Messerschmitt 19 that's tried pursuing us. We managed the distances accordingly, we went for the right interception at the right moment, and it means that Messerschmitt 19 now is going to get frustrated and instead try to go for our friendly B-29. But don't worry about that, we've got a friendly Tempest 2 coming in and they're going to tear the Messerschmitt 19 to pieces. They're out of position, shouldn't have gone for the bounty, as we pick up 3,000 credits to our favour. In the meantime then, we note a Spitfire LF Mark 9 coming charging towards us, and thanks to the fact we spotted them early, we can begin to dive. Not too sharply at first, but now we begin to exacerbate our dive, while the Spitfire really coming in fast. And we can see here we're able to build up enough speed just to hold the distance for a long enough period of time to make that Spitfire come all the way down to ground level if they want to take us on. But the problem is, if they decide to latch onto our 6, we do not have the manoeuvrability advantage in any form other than our roll rate. And what we'll try to do is set up a set of vertical scissors and use our roll rate to frustrate the aim of the Spitfire, and perhaps we can get them on one of the cut overs. And we can see as we go to higher speeds, our control surfaces begin to lock up, but more on that in a second. So we start the dogfight then, cutting over the top, and then rolling over the top as a result. And it seems as though the Spitfires actually had to go into a head-to-head with a friendly Messerschmitt 19K on our team, who came over to assist us. And we may have even had the advantage in terms of being able to roll over the top if the Spitfire hadn't reacted early enough, but we'll never know thanks to our friendly, who we say thank you to. And now you can see how we can build up enough time in order to lure our opponents back to friendly skies, and therefore somebody will pick up the kill. Or at least we'd hope that. In the meantime then, we did say about high speed lockup. As we go to get some altitude on the edge of the map, let's talk about the high speed lockup on the C-3. Now you're probably wondering at this point as well, the fact that there is a high speed lockup and it's actually quite a sharp one. Does that make this plane weak for boom and zoom? Well, we'll see later on it's not as much of a limitation, but for now let's talk about the thresholds. So your strongest control surface, which is your aileron or your ailerons, we should say the plural, whereby you've got one of the highest roll rates, if not the highest, at your batter rate and tier for a fighter, your roll rate will lock up to only have 25% of your roll rate capability left, between 650 to 850 kilometers an hour. Now this is a gradual lockup, and the thing is it's not going to be too much of a problem as long as you manage your dive accordingly for those boom and zoom passes. Although it does become a problem, as we saw against that Spitfire LF Mark 9, if you've got someone on your 6 and they're just not going to leave you alone, they're going to follow you all the way down to the dirt. Meanwhile, your weakest control surface, which is your rudder, which is decent, it will eventually work, but it takes some forcing in order to get the plane to turn, especially if you want to do a flat rudder turn. This begins to lock up at 550 km an hour, that lockup maximising at 750 km an hour, at which point you'll only have 50% of your controllability left on this surface. And then in the middle you've got your elevator, which is a heavy control surface, but once you get it going it works okay, although you have to keep in mind your loop circle is very wide. As we swing down the Cow-84 here we just can't seem to get a decent hit on them, and we pull away. Your elevator begins to lock up at 700 km an hour and the lockup maximises at 800 km an hour, and you lose 50% of your elevator's capability. As we make a second pass here at the Cow-84, we score a couple hits, we can see some sparks off their right hand wing, but we're not going to get any damage out on them. A little bit frustrating because we thought we had some clean shots lined up, but never mind. They were a little bit inaccurate as they looped over the top of us, and now we're just going to break away. Using our war emergency power if needs be, just to build up our speed a little bit more as the Co comes around to try and get a shot on us. So with these high speed lockup thresholds, what you have to consider straight away is, if you don't think about the rudder as such, because the rudder is the weakest control surface and you're not really going to be using it as much unless you're going into manoeuvres such as a hammerhead, how does this limit my boom and zoom capability? Well, your limitation begins to kick in at 650 km an hour, but because of the gradual lockup on your roll rate, really you're only going to start feeling the effects of your roll rate lockup and your elevator lockup combined once you hit 750 km an hour. That's when it becomes pronounced. And at 750 km an hour, unless you're attacking your foe in a boom and zoom pass from say a distance of 3,000 metres from above them, i.e. you've got 3 kilometres between yourself and the target, you should not be hitting 750 km an hour or going beyond that by an extreme margin. Instead you should build up your speed and sort of come close to 700 to 750. And even then, when you're coming in at the most extreme speed, so 850 km an hour plus, and what the maximal dive speed of this aircraft being at 1002 km an hour, by the time you get close to your foe is probably not going to have noticed you if they haven't already, whereby they will not be able to get out the way and you can just rip them to pieces with your firepower. So the lockup isn't as much the problem as it may sound to be at first glance. And what of your firepower there? You just need to make sure you're accurate with your firepower, something we saw against that Cow-84 Co a little bit earlier on, whereby even the slightest inaccuracy means that the accurate guns that you have at your disposal are going to miss completely. But that's a pilot error, not a plane error. Now, as we've headed out towards the northeast, once again, in order to build up altitude, we've still got an F8f and a P80 above us. Now the P80 we're not too worried about, because if we go head to head with that, yes they've got 650 caliber machine guns, but we feel confident because they're nose mounted as well, they'll have to fully commit to the head on, and so do we, and therefore we can rip them to pieces. The Bearcat's the issue. We don't really want a situation like in the first game once again. We want to try and avoid baiting their attention. Unfortunately for us, they're going to intercept our friendly PE-8. Unfortunate for our friendly bomber and for the efforts of our team. But this provides us with the room to get the altitude to move back into the interceptor role. And really, if we hadn't been confronted early on, perhaps we could have been in the escort role for our friendly bomber and therefore be above what's happening right now. But we can only dream of that. In the meantime, as we build and build altitude, what else is there to note? Well, the energy retention of this plane, what of it being rather poor, you can use that in a dogfight. Now, in the first game, we saw that the energy retention, was rather poor when we came out of the dive on the PP4Y, whereby we didn't build up as near enough altitude as we did coming down. But the important thing to note is, when you deploy your combat flaps and even your landing flaps, these will bleed a rather nice amount of energy, meaning that whilst you don't have a very tight turn circle, you can really cut your speed and come around on foes. Alternatively, if you just want to manage your energy in a dive, you can do so by the usage of your flaps. On top of that, because of your weaker energy retention, continuous loops on foes, so if you've got multiple foes underneath you, perhaps you're prancing above the enemy spawn, constantly bouncing the same set of foes as they come up towards you is going to be a very dangerous prospect. Because after your first bounce and loop over, your energy state will have been reduced significantly, and that means that a lot of foes that are climbing up towards you will catch you by surprise and can catch you when you're right on the tip of your loop or just about to turn over in your hammerhead. So repeated passes on foes are dangerous to an extent, because if your foe is given even a little bit of space, and we're talking about like-for-like battle rating planes here, and even lower battle rating aircraft such as the Yakotlov Yak-3P, the Messerschmitt 109 G6, and then going up to like-for-like battle rating such as the Spitfire F Mark 24, these foes will be able to build up their energy state accordingly and cut you off for your second loop. And some of that can be attributed to the fact that because of how heavy your plane is, your ability to build up your energy is weakened compared to others. Whereby you'll notice on a lot of aircraft that you'll fly compared to this, you just got to slam down the war emergency power on the engine and the plane just built up an absolutely irresistible amount of speed. With the C-3, it's a bit more deliberate and slow. As we rip apart this Tempest 2 here to pick up another kill, boom and zoom past them, and we can see how we hit approximately 800 km an hour when we hit the target, but we managed that dive accordingly, and by the time they could have reacted, they weren't able to react. So that comes back to our point earlier about the whole lockup thresholds not being too much of an issue if you catch your foe by surprise. Alternatively, if you just make sure you're hitting the noticeable part of the lockup threshold right as you're about to open fire. In the meantime, we're just judging foes in the distance. We're providing escort to our B-29 as well, and our next target on the list is an F8f Bearcat. We're swinging down now, not using our war emergency power, we don't need to. Cutting over the top using our roll rate here to follow them, and we open fire, tearing them to pieces for another kill. And we can see how we just need to land 1 or 2 hits with that 30mm cannon, or say 1 second of burst mass with our 20mm cannon, and the foe's going to be ripped to pieces. We've got the firepower to deal with pretty much anything we need to. And that's one of the pleasures of this aircraft, is the fact that yes, you compromise your manoeuvrability, you compromise your climb rate, and you compromise a lot of performance, but in the right situation you've got the firepower to tear everything to pieces. As we go head to head with the Messerschmitt 109G there, and before they can even open fire in return, cut them to pieces for kill number 4. And now we're going to take some pot shots at the B-29, not focus on that the Tempest is a bigger target in terms of priority, picking up a critical on the bomber, then cutting apart the Tempest for another kill, taking some light damage to our left hand wing. And you may note there are a significant number of fuel tanks in the wings of this aircraft. They don't seem to catch fire that often. And fires in this plane aren't really a problem. I've had very few fires when I've been hit. And when fires do occur, they do normally go out if you cut your engine before the airframe falls apart. But typically, as stated earlier, if you're going to get hit at this battle rating tier, expect the worst to happen if it's a sustained burst on you, because most foes are running 20mm cannon in large numbers or larger caliber cannon. It's not a case anymore where you can just absorb the shots coming from very light machine guns. Those days are long gone. Hi the world of the 7.7mm Vickers, for example. But in the meantime, as we come around, I should say 7.7mm Browning, my correction, as we come around here, we're now just going to continue escorting the B-29 for pretty much the rest of this game. We're just going to idle about in the skies at roughly 5,300 meters altitude, oscillating lower and higher as we need to, but there's not much else really to say here in terms of our role. But we can see how we flipped our role on its head, going from intercepting bombers to defending them. which is why a C-3 instated in a high altitude position is a dangerous threat because of how much it can bring to bear on foes, as we cut apart that Spitfire there as they're stalling out, predicting their path before we even need to get close enough for the lead indicator to appear. And again, that's the lovely thing about having guns with all similar muzzle velocities. Your 30 and your 20s all work in harmony, something we didn't find on the TA152H. But enough slapping down the old H variant, which is still competitive. As we now go into a hammerhead here, we can see how the very gradual state of our rudder control surface brings us about and we level out instead of coming down, with the enemy aircraft below us, the Typhoon being a very long distance away. We're just going to let them build a little bit more altitude first in case they're really tempted to come up once again. And outside of this, are there any other considerations? Well, perhaps one could say that the C-3 is a bit of a hidden threat, because from what I understand community-wise, this plane isn't seen as a viable proposition compared to a large number of the aircraft which are available at the Battle Rate and tier. What we are seeing here is it can do a good job if given the right circumstances to do so, and that can be said of all aircraft. In the right circumstances they'll perform well. The circumstances of the C-3 of course are a little bit different, with the fact you don't really have that competitive edge in terms of manoeuvrability. You have the roll rate in order to perform scissors manoeuvres, but you don't have the turn circle, or just the overall agility of a good number of foes. But this isn't a plane to be underestimated as such. And really the way to defeat this aircraft in pretty much anything it can face is to force it into a turn fight and force it to lose its speed. Because ideally you never want to let your speed drop below 300 km an hour because you'll begin to feel your stall effects. And the ideal speed range for this aircraft is between 400 to 700 km an hour. In roughly the 550 km an hour region, the control surfaces, bar the rudder which begins to decay, all the other control surfaces, as we pick up the assist on the B-29 from earlier, really come to life and the plane feels at its maximum agility. But outside of that, and even in that speed range, there are a large number of aircraft, such as the F8f-1B, the Griffon Spitfires, the Messerschmitt 19K4, the Tempest 2, the list goes on. They're all going to be able to outmaneuver this aircraft. And therefore, that's why I would recommend. There's no particular plane to do this in, but if you want to beat a C-3, force it into a turn fight and make sure it can't get altitude from the outset. And whatever you do, don't go for a head-on, as this P-80A5 shooting star very quickly realises as they turn their nose upward and try to continue climbing over the top of us. But what with the energy state we built up from that initial dive down on the enemy Typhoon, we don't have to worry as we pick up our 8th kill and rip the jet to pieces. And this is a brilliant plane for taking down enemy jets, because once it's in a good energy state, and you typically want to be in a good energy state to intercept a jet, you can really harass the hell out of the likes of shooting stars, Heinkel 162s, Yak 15s, etc. And you've got the firepower to make sure they fall apart when you hit them with accurate shots. Now, one thing we haven't talked about is ammo capacity, and this is one of the dark horses within the C-3's airframe. Now, you'd be thinking to yourself at this point, 650 cannon rounds, i.e. 20mm cannon rounds, that's a lot. Well, because you've got 4 20mm cannon and the fact you've got a varied ammo distribution, i.e. you've got more shells for the wing-mounted cannon than those mounted in the engine cowling, means that you have to be aware you actually exhaust your ammunition rather rapidly. Though your 30mm cannon does sustain the amount of rounds over a long period of time, as we pick up our 9th and final kill of this game on the Spitfire LF Mark 9. And therefore you do need to keep an eye on the ammo indicator to note that once you hit the last couple hundred rounds of ammunition, you're getting low and the guns mounted in the engine cowling will be running out of ammunition shortly, and then you only have the wing mounted cannon and what's left in your 30mm cannon to bear. Which is why on multiple occasions we have forced early reloads when we've got some time available. Of course, it's not essential, you're not going to run out of ammunition ridiculously fast, as we see the Tiger Cat coming towards us here, and the game comes to its end as we try to go into a dogfight with them. But you just need to be wary of ammo management as we now head towards our second set of post-game stats. With our 9 kills and single assist, we picked up 34,580 silver lions, and with a 10% research point booster active as well, as the same as the first game, we accreted 3,645 research points to our tally. Having already discussed how to defeat the C-3 in a given matchup, i.e. force it into a turn fight and confront it early on before it can get to altitude, one other thing we have to consider is that this plane is a victim of its own success, whereby in a head-on, this plane is forced to commit to said head-on. because it does not have the ability to evade incoming fire via the means of a snap roll, the typical evasion technique. Whereby if you decide to snap roll on this plane, I use the elevator and ailerons simultaneously, you'll find that on your opponent's screen you're actually going to sit in the same location on screen. You won't change laterally or vertically. And that's because the high roll rate of this aircraft, partnered with the sluggish elevator, means that this plane doesn't essentially do a snap roll, it just seems to roll in the sky, as if you're just creating a standard roll in your ailerons. On top of this, when you initiate a snap roll bringing in the rudder as well, after 3 iterations of said snap roll, especially at lower speeds, so below 350 km an hour, you've got a very high chance of kicking this plane into a flat spin, and when you do it will take some time to recover, and that provides your opponent with ample time to come around using their superior manoeuvrability and shoot you out the sky. So avoiding such circumstances today, we have hopefully demonstrated how the C-3 is a viable aircraft at its battle rating and tier, whereby it doesn't have the favourable manoeuvrability or overall performance characteristics of the vast majority of its competition, but it does have an absolutely lethal amount of firepower in its favour, along with an enduring climb rate which can really catch foes by surprise, especially enemy bombers. And that's exactly what this plane was designed for, the Zestora roll, smashing bombers out the sky, and you can see hopefully today how this plane replicates that very well in game. Therefore, if anything, I would call the TA-152 C-3 the dark horse of the skies of its battle rate and tier. It's not the plane that's going to get picked often, but by those who do pick it, you'll see them rack up a very nasty kill tally if they're not watched carefully. And so I've been TX141, and if you have enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future War Thunder videos on my channel. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, take care and good luck in the skies.